Hello, everybody out in Facebook Live land. It's Congressman Jamie Raskin coming at you with one of my favorite people in the world, Shirl Spicer, who is the county-wide museum manager for the Parks and Planning Department for Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission in the Department of the Parks. She has 25 years experience working in museum education. She's responsible for the programming on the park's historic sites, including the Oakley Cabin African American Museum and Park, the Kingsley Schoolhouse, the Agricultural History Farm Park, and most recently, the new Josiah Henson Museum and Park in North Bethesda, which I visited along with my staff, and we got an extraordinary tour of the Josiah Henson house, where Josiah Henson was enslaved and worked on that farm and managed a team of slaves. That's an extraordinary story. Henson became the model for, well, I'm getting ahead of ourselves here. Let me introduce you to Shirl Spicer. Shirl, welcome, and thank you for joining us on today, Juneteenth.
Excellent. Greetings, Congressman Raskin. Thank you so much for the opportunity and the invitation.
Well, to tell everybody what your job is so they get a sense of like the magnificent stuff you do. I'm sure a lot of kids would love to grow up and have your job one day.
And I would love for them to start today. My job is a lot of fun. It is programming our historic sites for Montgomery County Parks. And we have about 6 sites that are open to the general public that focus on the history that ranges really over 400 years almost. We have sites that were built in the early 1800s and even the late 1700s. So we talk a little bit about colonial history. We talk about, of course, the antebellum period and life during enslavement and life post-freedom. We have a few sites that focus on that experience of the newly emancipated African-American women, children, families, and how they are growing in these new communities in the county. We have Kingsley Schoolhouse that focuses on one-room school education, a time when schools are segregated. We explore that. And of course, the new Josiah Henson site focuses on the Reverend Josiah Henson and his journey from enslavement to freedom. We have a site focuses on the Underground Railroad history. So my job allows me to utilize that history degree to its full extent and good hiking boots, because you're in the field all the time. You're working with sites and getting to engage with people, from teeny tiny short people, our young visitors, to our senior, most experienced visitors, and they come and they share their knowledge and they learn, and their energy and creativity, and it's fun. It's fun.
Well, you are in the perfect place for you, and the perfect place for us. You did grow up in North Carolina. I'm compelled to say you went to school there, but you are a true Marylander now, and we're never letting you go.
Thank you.
And you're truly absorbed here. Okay, but you mentioned you mentioned the work that you do on Maryland history going all the way back to the 18th and 17th centuries. Maryland was, of course, one of the original 13 colonies. It was one of the original 13 states. It was, to our shame, a slave state, but it was a state that was on the side of the Union. Lincoln did dispatch those federal troops to go to make sure the legislature stayed with the Union. He could not afford to have the nation's capital cut off from the rest of the North. And that's part of the very interesting story I want you to tell us today about why the Emancipation Proclamation, written January 1st, 1863, released by the president, did not apply to Maryland and the other border states. Explain how that all happened.
So what happens is Maryland, as a border state, because we remain in the Union, we are not subject to the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation, which, if we all remember, frees those enslaved folks of African descent in the rebellious states, or those states who had seceded the Union. And because we had never seceded the Union, we remained a part of the Union. In January 1, 1863, that did not apply to all of those who were enslaved in Maryland.
And so Lincoln took the position that he could only emancipate the slaves in Virginia and North Carolina and Georgia and Mississippi because it was a war measure and it was for purposes of military necessity. But he said for the states that still presided over slavery that were part of the Union, he had no authority to free the slaves.
Right. It took a state constitution and an amendment to that Maryland state constitution that gets ratified in November 1st, 1864. That is what emancipates and ends slavery in the state of Maryland. And keep in mind, for our DC folks, it is 2 years earlier that DC abolishes slavery, the District of Columbia, April in 1862. And then, of course,
and that was Congress acting to abolish the slave.
Yes, to abolish slavery within the federal district in 1862. And then you have the proclamation in 63. So there's this large group throughout the South that know about it. But then in 1865, it's not until Texas learns of this emancipation and the abolition of slavery after the end of the Civil War does word reach them. And we come upon this in June 1865. So we arrive at our Juneteenth celebrations. They're the very last to know, which is how we get to this glorious annual celebration that has left the Southwest and migrated north and west and northeast and mid-Atlantic area. And we all now celebrate this Juneteenth celebration, one of the oldest that commemorates this end of enslavement in the U.S.
And there's something so beautiful about that, marking the date of celebration, not to when the first enslaved African Americans were liberated, but the last, because it's almost as if to say, none of us is free until everybody's free, until we get the last people out. And as you say, these were enslaved African Americans in Texas who did not learn of the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment until after the fact, right?
After the end of the war, that's right.
After the end of the war, and then they got the news, and then presumably the slave masters were not eager to spread the word in Texas about what had happened, right? And so, actually, I just signed on as a co-sponsor of legislation that my friend Sheila Jackson Lee, who's a representative from Texas, brought to me yesterday to make Juneteenth a national holiday to recognize it. So I don't know what that it certainly won't be able to happen for this year, but I'm hoping that we get there. And it really is a very hopeful, optimistic holiday and celebration, thinking of that freedom does have this momentum. Well, wait. So let's get back then to the Josiah Henson house, because he's a fascinating figure. Tell us about Josiah Henson.
Oh, the Reverend Josiah Henson. So I'm going to tell his story in like 2 seconds or less. But as we learn about Reverend Henson, so he's born in Charles County, but he grows up here on a plantation belonging to Isaac Riley in Montgomery County in Rockville, what was historically Rockville before it became North Bethesda. And in growing up here enslaved on this plantation, he becomes one of Riley's most trusted and one of his best serving enslaved laborers, to the point where he is also become the overseer or the superintendent, as Henson calls himself, on this plantation. And
let me pause for 1 second. One of the things I learned from you when you gave us the tour was that more than 1/3 of the people living in Montgomery County at the time were slaves.
Yes, were enslaved. Absolutely. Yeah. So it's a big deal that he has this level of control on this particular plantation, but keep in mind, it doesn't change his status. He's still enslaved. He's still property to Riley. And with Henson, the reason we know what we know about him is through his slave narrative or his autobiography that gets published once he escapes to freedom. And one of the reasons that we tie him to the Juneteenth celebration is that, one, he's born June 15th, 1789. So his birthday was a few days ago. And it falls right in line with when we are celebrating Juneteenth with our sister county, our partner county in Prince George's. And we highlight Henson's life and his journey from this enslavement to freedom, because he escapes in 1830 to Canada with his wife and 4 children. So he self-emancipates. He doesn't wait for legislation to free him. He self-emancipates, he and his family. And family is one of those key factors in the celebration of Juneteenth, is this reunification of family. And in looking at the people and ensuring that we all are appreciating our family members with us. So Henson, to him, definitely family is important. He took everyone with him. And in Henson's life, he has become, from this young boy who was born enslaved, a minister, Methodist minister. While enslaved, he does escape to freedom. And what he does with his freedom is he establishes a community, a labor school for runaways, as they were known, or fugitives, freedom seekers, as we call them, coming from the United States into Canada. In Ontario, Canada, in a small settlement called Dawn, they would find refuge and education, a safe establishment to grow their families, to learn to read and write. There's the school that's established there. Henson goes on to become a conductor on the Underground Railroad. So many people don't know this about him, that he goes back to, because his escape is actually from Kentucky. So he goes back to Kentucky in order to bring those to freedom to Canada, and is definitely tied to this network, the Northern Network of the Underground Railroad. He's a speaker across, an internationally known speaker. He speaks throughout the North on the abolition of slavery.
But he's still living in Canada at that point?
Yes, he never returns to the United States. He lives out the rest of his life until 1883, until he passes, in Canada. And so he is this international figure. But the thing that makes him most uniquely famous is in 1852, his autobiography gets published in 1849. 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin is published, and it's by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And that main character, Tom, is shaped after the events of Henson's life. It's shaped after him. And so once that fame of the book is connected to the real man, Reverend Henson, and people realize, oh, wait, Reverend Henson is Uncle Tom. In that time period, Uncle Tom was written to be a martyr. This was meant to be a book about the abolition of slavery, to help propel it forward. So this was very much working for his favor to build on the fame of Uncle Tom's Cabin, this novel that's being reread all across the world and has been translated into dozens of languages during the 1850s. It's a widely popular book. So there's fame gained for that, along with what he's doing on the ground in Canada and the work that he's doing through the Methodist Church, as well as the Underground Railroad. So we definitely celebrate his journey to freedom during this time period. What we are fortunate to have in Montgomery County is the site where he was held in enslavement on the former Riley plantation, but we have transformed that through the good work of the community and our staff and teams to create a modern museum that will open, that will tell the story of his life. So to introduce him to those who have never heard of the Reverend Josiah Henson, and then to reintroduce him to those who may have learned about him years ago. And so we can celebrate his life along with all of the other famous Marylanders who we appreciate and we celebrate.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, thank you for giving us so much depth and so much historical knowledge on this Juneteenth holiday. Tell us about some of the things you've got going on. Are you doing a lot of lectures and events today and through the weekend? And
because of our current situation with COVID-19, we don't have a lot of live activities. Our Prince George's County, our sister county of the commission, Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, Prince George's County has an annual Juneteenth celebration. And when it's live, it's huge. It's like 5,000 plus people. But this year they're doing a virtual celebration. So if you go online to Prince George's County Historic Sites, they'll find the links for the Juneteenth celebration that will be virtual. What we will be doing is focusing on Henson, and we are in the process here at Parks and working on our virtual and online programs until we're ready to reopen and bring everybody back to Parks later on this summer.
All right. Well, if you would just close with one question I want to offer to you, which is, you deal with really the searing pain and the agony that so many human beings lived through in slavery, and what a terrible thing it was. and it remains as a legacy and a stain on our country. And yet you always maintain this positive and optimistic attitude about what's possible. And I just wonder, how do you reconcile the pain of the past and the violence and the injustice with where we are today? And how do you see your role as an historical interpreter in trying to help us all make sense of it?
Oh, okay. So I see my role as an interpreter as one to ensure that the history in its accuracy is told first and foremost, that I give voice to those who we have never heard before. We've never heard the complete stories of Reverend Henson, of all of the other enslaved Marylanders and others throughout the country. So part of what I do and I'm charged with, and I'm proud and happy to do it, is to give voice to those many stories that we would otherwise never know about unless we had historic sites and museums and these sorts of things. And I would believe that the reason that I am most optimistic and I optimistic in what I do and hopeful in what I do, because in helping people learn and understand their history, they can in some way, I always hope, come to appreciate how we arrive at these difficult moments and that how we get through them. That this is not the first time that we have been struggling, and that through the lessons learned, and oh, if we just done this, okay, so now we need to do this. This is a lesson learned. So we move forward, we can endure, we can persevere. As a woman of color, I have in historical background of family members who've endured and persevered and moved forward. And so that is passed on to us. And I think it is that hopefulness that this moment that seems critical and crisis is necessary, and one that will propel us forward to make those necessary changes so that we improve upon the current situation and improve and make it better. But we've got to know our history. We've got to know our past. And I think that there are ways in what we do with museum interpretation and at historic sites, there are ways to engage our public so that you come to appreciate the dark and the really hard, desperate times of those who made it through the past, to see that we are our ancestors' dreams realized. We're it. And so there's hope in that. You know, I'm hopeful for this generation that's pushing and protesting and making sure their voices are heard. I'm pushing them and thanking them for doing that, because they are a part of that dream that is becoming realized.
Well, that's a beautiful way for us to end, and future generations will look back on this time and see what the young people did and what all of us did to try to contribute to the transformation of America. Thank you so much for what you do every single day. Is the Henson Museum open now, or is it closed through the crisis?
We're so close. We're so close.
But when we get through it,
in construction. So later on, towards the end of the year, we'll be putting out our announcement as to when we're going to be open to the public. But drive by definitely on Old Georgetown Road and check it out. Construction's ongoing during the summer, and it's so exciting to see.
Well, I loved it. I'm coming back to see it as soon as we get through this nightmare. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And stay close. All best to you.
All right, the best to you. Stay well. Bye-bye.